Chapter 90 The 7th STA You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The Violet Ether. The 7th Stat. Following the logical order of the rainbow colors, it was an expected revelation. The pure ether that was absorbed and then compressed upon the death of a creature was white. In other words, an amalgamation of the different types of ether. However, it should not be forgotten that the colors in different types of ether did not really exist. A body was by default imbued with a certain amount of ether depending on its world of origin. There was no distinction between strength, constitution, and agility. The encoded ether simply attached the ether to our bodies by encrypting it. This forced it to follow certain routes and behave in a certain way that amplified the desired faculties. So what could this violet ether possibly be? Jake had his own thoughts on the matter. Generally speaking, red, orange, yellow and green affected the body, cyan and indigo affected the brain and sensory organs. In other words, our consciousness, our perception of the world. These colors were connected to each other. The nervous system was modified when one gained in strength or agility, became more resilient when one gained in constitution or vitality. The first 6 stats, despite the distinction between the physical and the mental, were still based on the human body itself. The ether only amplified existing functions. Therefore, the 7th stat had to touch the mind and spirit, but without this direct connection to the physical body. More simply, the soul. Does it concern the soul, or the psychic realm? Jake investigated, deciding to test his hypotheses. Lu Yen, who hadn't spoken much so far, tapped his brother's shoulder to let her take over. The violet ether is called extrasensory perception by the oracle system. The shy young woman merely stated. At first glance, its effect is not much different from classical perception. To be honest, in my case, it's even less effective. What do you mean? First of all, I have to explain why I unlocked it so early and you didn't. Lu Yen stammered, suddenly looking at her feet in embarrassment. I'll take care of it, sis. Her brother intervened to help her out of the predicament with a conciliatory smile. He knew exactly what was bothering her. Lu Feng stared at Jake and Kyle in turn, feeling awkward about it as well. Finally, after taking a deep breath, he resolved to spill the beans. Simply put, we're idiots. All of us. Lu Yen has been an exceptional genius since childhood. A genuine one. An IQ higher than 210, perfect pitch, 25/10 of visual acuity, it really exists. The person in question can read newspaper characters of 1 mm at a distance of 5 m, and can see ultraviolet. The normal human has 3 cones to see colors. Blue, red and green, some very rare have a 4th one. So they see colors you have never seen before. Basically, her intelligence and senses are unique. Her body status indicated 21 of intelligence and 20 of perception as soon as she received her oracle. It is suspected that these are the or one of the conditions required to unlock extrasensory perception. Jake's ego had just taken a hit. Even though there were many gifted people in his family, it was still classic giftedness. 150 or 160 IQs for the best of them. Impressive and unattainable for most, but in the realm of the possible. In comparison, Lu Yen was a real oddity. I don't think that's enough to unlock the 7th stat, otherwise our robots equipped with a quantum computer processor would have long since developed psychic abilities. Jake pointed out a flaw in Lu Feng's explanation. Indeed. The young Asian boy nodded. Even on Earth you may have heard of mentalists, psychics, fortune tellers, people who are luckier than others, or who claim to have excellent instincts. Jake didn't dare contradict him, even though it was superstitious bullshit to him. Of course, all these people are fakes. Lu Feng immediately explained himself when he saw Jake and Kyle's puzzled expression in front of him. Most of them are quacks, and those who formally believed it cannot pass the test of a serious double-blind study. So. Kyle interrupted him, not sure what he was getting at. And so, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist or that it never existed. There really are some strange phenomena. It's just that most of the time it acts below the level of evidence required to be authenticated. Lu Yen is one of those cases. We realized at an early age that she won abnormally often at games of chance and that her decisions were often correct when instinct or luck was the only decision-making element present. Couldn't it just be a subconscious instinct? Jake immediately disputed in good Cartesian. After all, if her brain processes information faster and her senses are much more developed, she may be absorbing and processing a lot of information she is not aware of. Body language, the look, a texture, the smell of the wind, instinct may seem supernatural, but it responds to a logical explanation. You're not wrong. Louis Feng admitted it was a valid argument. But we think it's just the second condition. With great intelligence and sharp senses, we can develop a kind of sixth sense, which synthesizes the information recorded by our senses and interprets it. According to Lu Yen, this would open the door to extrasensory perception. Jake wasn't at all convinced by that speech. Artificial intelligence on Earth was well developed in the 22nd century. It was perfectly possible to create a robot more intelligent than Lu Yen and capable of perceiving much more information in its environment, such as electromagnetism or X and gamma rays. This probably had to exist, at least experimentally. Lu Yen suddenly realized that they were mistaken about extrasensory perception, as was his brother. She tried to clarify her brother's words in her small voice. I unlocked the 7th ether stat when I received my bracelet, but that doesn't mean you don't have that stat too. Like the other ether stats, we all had 10 points by default on Earth. It's the same with the violet ether. I only unlocked it because the Oracle system deemed the requirements were met. All the missions and quests that I've done in trial worlds have given me a lot of points, making me rank 3, almost rank 4. This is a special reward. And my real feeling was that the Oracle considered that I had already participated in several ordeals. Some kind of bug, even though I don't think this artificial intelligence can bug. It was plausible, thought Jake. What do you think, she? It is likely. She confirmed in a dull tone. The ordeals are extremely important to the Oracle. Conflicts between universes are resolved in part through these ordeals, and they are very important to the Oracle's growth. If the Oracle has deemed that she has exceptional talent to succeed in these ordeals, and meets the necessary conditions, a reward like this makes perfect sense. I see. Lu Yen, were you the best at trial worlds, or were other people better than you? Jake suddenly changed the subject. I don't know about that. There were only a few thousand players playing at that time. She tried to remember the events not without some difficulty. I think I was average. I was finishing the levels, but my final score wasn't exceptional. I don't think I was even in the top 2000 ranking of professional players. That was good news and bad news. It meant that mankind had many more prodigies than he had imagined and that their odds were not so bad. Even at the beginning of the 21st century, the absolute IQ record was 234, but many thought that this was incorrect, that IQ tests were simply inadequate. If that was true, it changed many things. Most of these geniuses had undoubtedly been approached and then recruited by the Earth government. Others like Lu Yen had probably refused, because they were too young or wanted to keep their freedom. That was the bad news. If he met such people in his ordeal, he would surely be a pawn at the mercy of their schemes. He could only hope that they were as far away from him as possible and that his ordeal would not be affected. It was the first time he had ever felt helpless. He felt like a kindergarten child having to prepare for a big debate on general relativity against Einstein himself. A painful experience. Especially for Einstein. In conclusion, he absolutely had to get smarter. The problem was that it would take a lot of ether to do that. A lot of ether. He realized then that the most important question had not been asked. What does extrasensory perception do? Chapter 91 Beginning of a New Alliance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Louis Feng appealed to his sister on this matter. Who better to answer than the one who had experienced its benefits firsthand? The young woman in question shrugged her shoulders while rubbing her chin as she contemplated her explanation with some degree of frustration. It's not that simple to explain. You have to live it to make the difference. Lu Yen attempted a timid, hesitant response. Basically, the answer's in the name. But I wasn't lying when I said it was of little use to me now. What do you mean? Jake asked, inviting her to elaborate further. Well, what is not perceivable by our senses or our technology? She addressed him with another question, whose answer was quite evident. There were only two things he knew that technology could not detect. What had to do with the soul or the spiritual realm? That was why it was called the paranormal. If it was normal, it wouldn't be so hard to verify. The other thing their technology couldn't detect was the ether. We could detect gravity waves, the Higgs boson or quarks, but ether was out of their reach. Other things might have been undetectable that he didn't know of. This is exactly like that. And that's why it's useless to me right now. The reserved young woman confirmed her deductions after reading his expression changes. Because the oracle device already allows us to see the ether. Kyle made his first and last intelligent remark of the entire conversation at that very moment. That's right. Lu Yen validated his theory, the playboy feeling like a schoolboy who just got a good mark. Ednel.co, you can't really see the ether, but you can feel it. The older brother added his own personal touch. Yeah, that's the most important thing. I can feel the ether flow very faintly as it passes through me, and the one in the air that comes into contact with my body and that I breathe. Unfortunately, I can't do anything with it. Jake meditated on this fact for a brief moment, untying his crossed legs, then straightening up to get the blood moving. I can think of only one reason for this. He suddenly theorized out loud, to make his point. Ether only amplifies the capacities of our bodies, just like the properties of matter or energy. A simple multiplier. Our muscles are stronger, an object will be sturdier, and so on and so forth. I suppose the reason why the effect is so limited is because our bodies are missing a crucial element. A soul. The two siblings looked at each other for a brief moment before turning their attention to Jake. They had made the right choice for their alliance. Now they had to hope it wouldn't backfire. My sister and I feel the same way. But Lu Yen has an interesting theory. You may have noticed that among the sub-attributes of intelligence is control. Yes, indeed. Jake had repeatedly wondered what the differences were between the control provided by agility and that of intelligence. It was obvious by now. Well, so the whole idea is that it's about mind control, brain control. First of all, it increases willpower, emotional or attention control. Kind of like an advanced meditation practitioner. But on a higher level, we think it's about accessing and controlling this ether flowing through us. Without perception, there's no control. The seventh stat opens the door to control not only our mind, but our environment. If we can influence and use this ether as fuel with our minds, then we will have a stable soul, even if our bodies wither away. That's the key, I think, to evolving beyond our limitations. This was opening up brand new perspectives. The discovery of the violet ether's role as well as the existence of thousands of prodigies eclipsing it intellectually had altered his plans dramatically. Of the 21 ether points he had left, he immediately spent 16 to increase his ether intelligence by 1 point. He suddenly felt the clarity of his mind improving, as if the fog was gradually dissipating. He was not yet as clear as he had been before his transformation into a Thrasgenian, but it was already much better. When he suddenly became clever again, he realized that one quickly got used to being stupid. Maybe that explained why so many people thought they were always right, or why so few thought they were dumb. Yet it was well known that we were all someone's fool. Gaining control over one's emotions and focus made a very real difference in a context where spikes in thrusgenian hormones made him moody. It's our turn to ask one last question. Louis Feng abruptly changed the subject, calling the debate closed. You're from another red cube, right? So I'm guessing you know some of these slaves. Is there anyone we should be wary of? Jake pointed his gaze at Yerode and Lamine, who were eating silently crouched against another column. They too had chosen to keep a low profile. The tall one with darker skin and a sharp body is Yerode, the leader of a mercenary group and a criminal. The man standing next to him, who had lost his long beard at the barber's earlier, is Lamine, a skilled marksman. He can see in the dark and never misses his target. It's not good to be a woman with them around. As he said this, Jake glanced insistently and meaningfully at the shy young woman, who from the beginning had not spoken much, often leaving her brother to answer in her stead. He hoped for her that her talent in trial worlds wasn't limited to virtual reality. Hearing Jake's warning, Louis Feng's eyelids suddenly contracted, before relaxing again. The Chinese man cast a vicious glance at the African guy, as if to warn him that if he came near his sister he would pay the price. Naturally, Yerode couldn't care less, continuing to gulp down its foul porridge with little spirit. My turn to ask one last question, and it will be the same one. Do we have to pay attention to anyone in particular? Louis Feng pointed straight at the taciturn Middle Eastern man. The same man who had received, like Jake, a teasing wink from the wife of Servius Cassius. After having his head and body shaved, it had become almost impossible to determine the ethnicity of the participants. He was in the same camp as us. He's Lebanese, former firefighter. His wife and daughter were devoured before his eyes by digesters, hence his expression of, "I have a grudge against the whole world." I think he's a good guy, but in his current state I think it's better not to provoke him. We've seen him in action, and he's surprisingly powerful for an ordinary fireman. Apart from him, that fat guy over there with the freckles is Hugo. Kind of goofy, not mean. The skinny young lady at the next table is Mia. She doesn't talk, but nobody in her original group dared to bother her. The woman in question could not be considered pretty, or even charming. Being only skin and bones and with her short hair, she could have been mistaken for a man with an androgynous morphology. After that, the siblings said goodbye to them, returning to their spot. There was no point in rushing their collaboration. As long as they didn't harm each other and shared their information, it was good enough. Jake and Kyle, who were done eating, waited patiently for the dinner to finish so they could get back to their room. The gladiators bearing the mark of Servius Cassius were taking a wicked pleasure in feasting as slowly as possible, laughing and commenting incessantly on how delicious their meal was. At last, when they realized that their play act had left the new recruits completely indifferent, they quickly finished eating before returning to their quarters, leaving the recruits to their own devices. Priscus appeared out of nowhere, clapping his hands to guide them to the dormitories. It went exactly as he had described to them earlier in the day. The nicest rooms with windows had been occupied by the first arrivals, but he mischievously reminded them that it was up to them to agree on who would sleep where. Once the veteran gladiator was gone, the tone quickly rose, soon turning into heated disputes. Minutes later, the first fights broke out. The more aggressive and confident ones tried to impose themselves, throwing out the belongings of the previous occupants of the rooms they had chosen. The Thrusgenian's short-fused temperament came to the fore at the worst possible moment, the situation escalating in a snap into a full-scale brawl. As for Jake, he just threw himself on the first straw mattress at the entrance of the corridor, falling asleep immediately. He would have plenty of time to fight in the days to come. Chapter 92, First Day of Training. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Crack. Everybody up, you maggots. Hurry your asses up, and faster than that. The cracking of a whip on the stone floor of the corridor, followed by the bellowing of Priscus the Lame, abruptly snatched the new recruits from the arms of Morpheus. Jake was no exception and grumbled in a bad mood as he heard the cries coming from all around him. it couldn't be said that he had spent his best night ever. The straw bed wasn't inherently uncomfortable, but it clearly wasn't worth a good mattress. Add to that the lack of pillows, sheets and blankets, and it was downright painful for a householder like him. Fortunately the climate near Helios was hot and dry. Temperatures cooled down in the evening, but they had no difficulty in enduring the coolness despite their simple tunic. Many gladiators wore only simple loincloths with protective cups to protect their private parts. This was a dress style that Jake would eventually adopt over the next few days. When he opened his eyes, the first thing Jake noticed was that it was still dark. His room didn't have a window, but it was far too dark in the hallway with the torches out. No wonder the wake-up call had been so violent. He was still feeling drowsy, a sign that he was in the middle of his slow-wave sleep when he was suddenly awakened from his torpor. Once up, he only had to put on the dubious-looking leather sandals that they had been given after the thermal baths. A new tunic made of coarse cotton had also been supplied to them the day before, replacing the one they had sweated in during the forced march to the Ludus. On leaving his room, which looked more like a prison cell, he walked blindly to the outside. He congratulated himself for having had the good idea to choose the room at the entrance of the corridor. It saved him from fumbling in the dark and stumbling over the other slaves. Outside, the yellow moon was full, casting its golden light over the inner courtyard of the Ludus. Looking up at the starry sky, devoid of any pollution, Jake immediately felt better, feeling that the situation could have been worse. This was directly confirmed by the slaves who came out of the dormitory wing one after another. Many of them had bruises or black eyes. One of them grimaced as he held his right hand against him, whose fingers were at a dangerously ominous angle. The fight for a good room had obviously not made everyone happy. For every winner, there was a loser. Some people who had not even tried to participate found themselves involved in the scuffle and had been injured despite their prudence. Kyle had his knuckles red and his lower lip swollen and covered with a scab, a sign that he was one of those idiots who had lost his temper in yesterday's fight. Unfortunately for him, he didn't have the same stats of intelligence as Jake. So it was bound to happen sooner or later. The latter had in fact tried in the first place to stay away from all this. Problem was, he still wanted a real bed, unlike Jake who didn't mind sleeping on the floor. If he had been in his right mind, he probably would have made the right choice. Regrettably, he had not, and he had learned his lesson. Slept well. Jake chuckled, barely holding his own laugh. HMF, I've known better. Kyle snarled in response, trying to ignore Jake's amused gaze or else his aggression would resurface against the wrong person. If he attacked this brute, he wouldn't just get away with a few bruises. Yerode and Lamine walked out of the building with their hands covered in dried blood, but this time it wasn't theirs. They had enjoyed themselves last night and were in a great mood. The Asian siblings were doing well, as were Elias, Mia and Hugo. Other people like Jake had wisely chosen their rooms near the entrance so they didn't get involved in the brawl. When everyone was outside, Priscus cracked his whip again and motioned for them to follow him. Contrary to their expectations, he didn't take them to the open-air canteen of the Ludus for breakfast, but straight to the training grounds in the middle of the arena. Jake found that gladiators bearing the mark of Servius Cassius sleeping on the floor above had not had to get up, proof that they were not all treated the same. The competition had already begun. Once in the arena, the first thing the slaves noticed was the water point with a tap under a canopy against the walls of the bleachers. There were also all sorts of wooden boxes, presumably filled with equipment and other materials intended for their training. Getting his first opportunity to observe all the new recruits in one place, Jake estimated that there were almost 500 of them. An impressive number, even in an arena of this size. Gladiators bearing the mark of the Ludus were far fewer in number. Perhaps 100. That was of course without counting the guards and other gladiators now performing other duties. The ratio of men to women was 70/30. Perhaps most of the women who didn't want to fight had been bought by someone else, as the ordeal had a different fate in store for them. Jake had a hunch that their first test would determine whether or not they were fit for the training. Those who didn't give their best could be turned back into simple servants. This could be a good way to get information if you were planning a real conspiracy, but counterproductive if you wanted to become stronger. Priscus had them lined up in front of him with a great deal of whipping, the few idiots trying to drink from the tap rewarded with a nice gash in the back. The Thrasgenian slaves were stronger than mere humans, but that didn't stop them from bleeding and gnashing their teeth. The veteran gladiator then stood in the ground like an eye, staring at them without showing any sign of movement in a painfully heavy silence. Slowly time passed. The golden moon faded behind the rising sun, a red and purple sky gradually replacing the night. Even then, the lame old gladiator remained motionless and listless. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, the slaves heard the sound of voices coming from the dormitories. The gladiators were awake. To their dismay, they saw the professional gladiators heading towards the cantina, beginning to feast happily over a hearty breakfast. Two gladiators, however, broke away from the group and walked alongside Priscus. The two warriors respectfully greeted him with one hand clasped over their hearts before moving to his left. First, let me remind you of the facts. Priscus abruptly broke the silence in a stern tone. You are but vulgar slaves and nothing more. But it is up to you to become gods of the arena. Here in the Mermid Empire, only strength is respected. No matter your origin or race, if you prove your worth in the Colosseum, everyone will worship you. If you fail, you will die. Training is not without risk of accidents. Training new gladiators is expensive. Anyone who decides to take this training will have to fight in the next games organized in honor of the Imperator's victorious return. By will or by force. Rumor has it he'll be back in a month, some say 2. That's how much time you have to train before your first fight. When Priscus dropped that bomb, many indecisive slaves showed signs of hesitation. The gladiators had much better living conditions, but you had to be alive to enjoy them. Those who do not want to fight, step forward. No harm will come to you, and Kreis here will assign you other duties. Priscus declared, pointing to one of the two men. This one was rather puny for a gladiator, but his muscles were extremely well defined. Like all gladiators in the Ludus, his skin was tanned by the sun. His black hair was short and he wore a mustache that did not match the cuirass he was wearing. He looked more like a merchant than a fighter. Ultimately, about 10 people stepped forward to give up their gladiatorial training. None of them were participants. Satisfied with the small number of wimps, Priscus pointed his finger at Kreis again. For those who follow this training and hopefully will join our brotherhood, Kreis is also named the smuggler in this Ludus. He revealed with a faint smile. If you have any information to pass on or if you need something from outside the Ludus, Kreis is the one to consult. Of course, he'll take his commission out of your wages. Jake memorized the smuggler's features, sensing that they would be in frequent contact in the days to come. Kreis abandoned them soon after, followed by the 10 slaves who had renounced. Priscus' faint smile gradually faded away, a cold and intimidating countenance replacing it. Now that we are convinced of your determination, the time has come to commence the training. Chapter 93 The Sad Story of Myrmidian Blood. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The new recruits could still hear the gladiators' enthusiastic discussions and the sounds of cutlery coming from the cantina. Without this background noise, one could probably hear the slaves' stomachs rumbling. The sun was now completely up and a blue sky without a single cloud loomed over their heads. The air was hot and dry despite the early hour. The day promised to be scorching if the trend remained the same. First of all, Priscus clapped his hands twice in succession, the thunderous clap resonated throughout the arena and beyond. Seconds later, the slaves saw a few slaves dressed in simple loincloths bring bronze cups filled with vermilion liquid on silver trays. The servants walked past each new recruit, inviting them to take one of these cups with subservient curtsy. Jake held the cup to his nostrils, sniffing the mixture. A metallic smell immediately attacked him. Blood. Though, the liquid was a little clear to be blood. He could easily make out the bronze at the bottom of the cup. This is the resource that you will fight for throughout your time in this ludus, and perhaps the reason you will survive and stay. The lame gladiator declared in a solemn tone. Diluted Myrmidian blood. Jake took a closer look at the blood this time, but he didn't find anything special. It was blood like any other. Yet, if Priscus talked like that, the blood must have had some special property. He was no longer as ignorant as when he arrived on B842. He had already drunk digester blood and enjoyed its miraculous effects. Anything with a developed etheric code had unique properties. The Myrmidians were the descendants of the hero Myrmid and could grow stronger or weaker with their personal victories or defeats. This blessing was a double-edged sword for the Myrmidians. Victories and successes were highly rewarded while defeats and failures were severely punished. A property that pushed the concept of meritocracy to the extreme. If Myrmid's blood had even a fraction of this effect on those who consumed it, it was frightening. First of all, drink the whole contents of your cup. Priscus ordered with a tone that would not allow any refusal. Whoever I see spitting or emptying his glass into the sand will be whipped 10 times and sent to the mine for a week, you are warned. The few crafty ones who were planning to quietly empty their cups or spit out the diluted blood later nearly choked when they heard the veteran's threat. With these words, no one dared to shy away from the task. The cups were all emptied in a few sips. The taste was not great, but it was diluted enough to make it taste somewhat like water. The servant slaves once again went through the recruits to collect their empty cups, inspecting them one by one, before confirming on their way out that none of them had shirked from their duty. Very well. Now that the blood is drunk, and until it takes effect, let me explain what it does and how it works here. The limping gladiator glared at them one by one, pressuring them into submission. Satisfied with the effect his intimidation was having on them, he continued his speech. First, the Myrmidian blood. You may not know how our Myrmidian blessing works, let alone the problems our people face because of it. So let me introduce you to our ways. A Myrmidian grows stronger in victory and weaker in defeat, it is true. Nevertheless, the Myrmid hero's bloodline has been gradually diluted over generations of his descendants. The most influential noble clans from Primus to Decimus are direct descendants of Myrmid's 10 children. The other commoner clans are all unwanted bastard heirs of the 10 main clans who have formed their own branch. The blood of the 10 clans is the purest, and therefore the blessing is stronger. The power of the blood seems to fade generation after generation. Only the Temple of Myrmid holds the secret to reigniting the power of this bloodline, and it is jealously guarded. Although, let's face it, their sacrifices surely had something to do with it. BL.net, the direct consequence of all this is consanguinity. The 10 clans isolate themselves and fornicate among themselves. The imperator himself is married to his own sister Antonia. As was his own mother to her brother. I'll leave you to imagine the problems that come with that. Of the many children of Sextus Caelius Augustus, half of the princes and princesses have some physical or mental handicap or deformity. Jake, like many other slaves, didn't know whether to laugh or hold his poker face. For a nation of warriors reputed to be invincible and descended from a great hero, knowing that all nobles were inbred and suffering from various deformities totally shattered the myth. You can laugh. I'm living proof of that myself. Quortus Priscus at your service. He downplayed it by pointing to his lame leg. Now what good is that to you? Diluted like this, not much, but it's better than nothing. Every time you go over your limits or defeat someone in some area or another, the blood will resonate with your emotions and your body making you stronger. If you fail, the opposite will happen. Of course there's a catch. Simply surpassing yourself has extremely limited effects. The Myrmidians actually become stronger through competition, by stealing the strength of other Myrmidians. This means that for an all-powerful man or woman at the top, hundreds of Myrmidians have served as a stepping stone for that person. By making you consume this blood, you become connected to all the Myrmidians and your strength can then be stolen from you, just as the other way around. This is why the great warriors of other peoples are highly valued. They are forced to drink the blood after having been weakened for days, and are repeatedly beaten until they are stripped of everything that made them strong. In other words, they are forced to lose in order to strengthen their opponent. It's a procedure much appreciated by the Myrmidian noble families. It gave a chill to every slave present. The thought of being deprived of food and water for weeks at a time and then having to fight tied up a spoiled Myrmidian to serve as his power source was absolutely frightening. Jake was happy that they had been sold in the public market square rather than in one of the private auction basilicas. If you want to progress faster, you'll need less diluted Myrmid blood, or blood from a purer-blooded Myrmidian. You Thrasgenians and other barbarians were born with robust bodies, but your potential is limited to your birth robustness or almost. You can beat our 10th and 9th cohorts of novice legionnaires effortlessly, but beyond that it gets trickier. Without consuming this blood, you will never defeat Myrmidian gladiators who have been fighting in the arena for years. They're all monsters. To prove his claim, Priscus raised his good foot slightly before suddenly trampling the arena floor beneath his feet. Boom! A geyser of dust and sand exploded around him, blasting him out of sight. When the dust fell back, they found Priscus in the same place, the ground under his feet having caved in more than a meter. He was now reaching their waist, looking like a dwarf. Shaking the dust off his armor and hair, the old veteran leapt out of the crater before whistling with 2 fingers to bring the servants back. The poor souls rushed in with shovels to close the hole, obviously used to this kind of scene. Cough, cough, now that the message is crystal clear to everyone, the rankings. Priscus resumed his speech as if nothing had happened. You are 493 trainees. 108 gladiators bearing the mark of Servius Cassius also train in this ludus. The guards are usually former gladiators who left the arena by decision or injury. Every day at the end of the day you will be given a right of challenge, you can and shall face another gladiator ranked above you. Your ranking will determine the resources you receive during your stay here. The first week is an exception. You'll simply be watched by Kazus here and a few other gladiators to be assigned a provisional ranking. At the end of this week the duels will begin. A wooden panel will be hung in the cantina with the resources for each position. Another one updated every day will display the new rankings. In the end, it was a fairly classic system, in the spirit of the Myrmidian tradition. The winners would move up in the rankings, while the losers would fall. The Myrmid blood they would consume would further that segregation. The strong would become stronger, and the weak would become weaker. The last in the ranking, however, was exempt from the challenge. This gave him the chance to train on his own for a while before joining the competition again in the future. If a player were to occupy this position, however, they would probably have wasted their time in this ordeal, since, with a few exceptions, their average level was higher than the native Thrasgenian. Especially since they had their oracle to handle all kinds of situations. Okay, I'll leave you to your training in the hands of Kazus. Show him what you got. Saying this, Priscus bid them farewell with his hand, leaving them with the only gladiator left. The terrifying Kazus. Someone they would curse day and night for months to come. Chapter 90. For the first tez you are listening at novelfull.audio. Kazus was, as his name might suggest, a Myrmidian. He had the same half-long Venetian blonde hair and golden irises as Princess Sexta Livia. Unlike Priscus, whose noble origin was unclear, Kazus was a warrior as strong as an ox with no debilitating deformities. The man was as tall as Girolf, though less stocky, but no less muscular. His face was young, but betrayed that he had already experienced many things. Like all gladiators, his skin was tanned and he wore a breastplate directly on his bare chest, as well as the belt, the loincloth, the protective shell and the regulation training sandals. Unlike Priscus, who seemed to worship his whip, Kazus carried only a wooden sword within the ludus. Priscus has entrusted you to me, and it's time for me to do my part. Kazus broke the ice with the recruits without wasting any time. I am Kazus, number 2 in the Ludus after Gerolf. I joined this Ludus only 2 years ago for personal reasons. I'm not a slave like you and my Myrmidian bloodline is pure enough. Rewards are of no use to me. Hence my meteoric rise to position. Gerolf isn't Myrmidian, but he's an exception. We'll do as my predecessor did with the new recruits before me. I will have you fight friendly against another gladiator and depending on your performance you will be placed in a group. The grouping does not affect your future ranking in any way. It will mostly affect the nature of the training you will undergo. For example, hiding your skills may be detrimental to your performance. So I advise you to do your best. The last words sounded like a warning from the oracle to the participants. The place was safe. What was less safe was the players' behavior towards each other. Concealing too much of their abilities would allow them to have a less strenuous training, but this would be reflected in the final rating of the ordeal. However, revealing everything was just as dangerous. Those who were aiming for a high score at the end of the ordeal carefully pondered in their mind what they could or could not show. Others who simply hoped to survive the 2 months of the ordeal did not ask themselves all these questions. Pick up a wooden sword from the crate over there and form an orderly line. Kazus ordered while holding back with great difficulty a yawn. As soon as the other gladiators have finished their lunch, we'll start. It may take a good part of the morning, but I want to go through you one by one. Luckily for them, the gladiators were almost done with their breakfast. The clatter of cutlery had fallen silent, as had the laughter and saucy jokes. The new recruits waited a few more minutes before the gladiators of the Ludus joined them. Instead of starting their training as they had been used to, they leaned against the arena walls under the bleachers with folded arms to watch the show. When they were all there, young gladiators as well as veterans, Kazus turned to his fellow gladiators in search of a volunteer. Let me do it, Kazus. The gladiator Jake had seen bullying a participant the day before, stepped out of his group with a conquering step. His sadistic smile hid an inferiority complex towards Kazus. Not once did his receding gaze meet Kazus. Very well. Kazus accepted his initiative with a nod. So it will be Nias who will be testing you today. I warn you, Nias, this is a friendly fight. If you let go, I'll be there to show you what it feels like to be on the receiving end. The Nias in question managed to keep a smile on his face, but no recruit missed his action of gulping in the face of the threat. Don't worry, I know how to control myself. The brute promised in an insecure tone, perspiring profusely. You better be. In that case, let the first fight begin. An orderly queue had formed, but when the time came to be tested, the first in line was not so sure he wanted to go first. Terrified, he tried unsuccessfully to let the slave behind him go first, but the slave naturally refused. When Nias and Kazus saw their damn little game, both Nias and Kazus soon grew impatient. White. The number 2 in the Ludus rendered his verdict. Too scared to fight in a secure environment, so he'll have to grow some balls first. A great burst of perfectly synchronized laughter erupted from the professional gladiator's side after Kazu's remark, as if hazing the newcomers were their favorite pastime. Meanwhile, a pretty, short-dressed maid quickly appeared with several jars of paint. Approaching the slave who had refused to fight, she dipped one of the brushes in the white paint pot and then painted a large white stain on his coarse cotton tunic. The recruit in question was so intimidated that he didn't dare move throughout the procedure until Nias' voice shouted him out of his stupor. Next. The maid returned to Kazu's side with her jars of paint and brushes. By the gentle gaze she had on him, she seemed to adore him both body and soul. The Myrmidian gladiator was definitely popular with the female population of the Ludus. The second slave who had refused to go first stepped forward with trembling legs in the center of the arena. The insistent gaze of the audience placed horrible pressure on him, as did Nia's sadistic smile. The warrior in question was making large twirls with his wooden sword to warm up, the whistling air with each movement only increasing the anxiety of the recruit. Attack me. Aeneas commanded without taking any guard. His posture was full of openings. Rafa. The slave began to scream to give himself courage, running towards his opponent with a mind empty of the slightest plan. Jake expected to see the poor man get beaten up, but he didn't. Clink. Aeneas simply parried the clumsy move with an air of pure nonchalance, before retaliating with an equally predictable up and down vertical slash. The speed was slow and the gesture exaggerated. The gladiator had taken Kazu's threat seriously and held his blows. A painfully embarrassing fight ensued, regularly punctuated by the hilarious laughter of the other gladiators, some huddled on the ground because their laughter made them sick to their stomachs. The poor man did his best, but between his fear and the fact that he was touching a sword for the first time, his performance was particularly pitiful. On several occasions he collapsed on the sand or stumbled, before finally spraining his ankle, thus ending the fight. A few seconds later, Kazu's male voice gave his verdict again. White. After that first fight, the other recruits regained their courage. They could hardly do worse than the first two, and Aeneas had kept his word, the slave had escaped almost unscathed. He owed his sprain and his falls to his own clumsiness. The recruits then fought one by one, with a few shy ones refusing to fight like the first. For a good half hour all that could be heard was the clash between the sword of Aeneas and that of the tested. The ruthless judgment of Kazus punctuated like a metronome these confrontations. White. 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 Yellow. White. As soon as one of the slaves showed satisfactory physical strength or some rudimentary notions of combat, a stain of yellow paint would cover his tunic. The few players who participated so far were, with two exceptions, yellow. They could not die. Therefore, they gave everything they had. The fact that the average ether level on this world was 8 points, *0.8, while the one on Earth was 10, *1, gave them a definite advantage over the native Thrasgenians. Eventually, as the line shrank, the first talented recruits came out of anonymity. Some were simply native Thrasgenians who had worked in physically demanding trades in the past as lumberjacks or blacksmiths. Their muscles were well developed, even compared to other Thrasgenians, and they were not so easily intimidated. Aeneas was a Myrmidian whose bloodline was extremely diluted. He needed to consume the Myrmidian blood provided by the Ludus to advance, and his strength was nothing like that of monsters like Gerolf, Priscus or Kazus. From an official ranking perspective, he was actually at the bottom of the list. 97th out of 108 gladiators bearing the mark of Servius Cassius. Therefore, while the serious candidates kept coming up, Aeneas gradually started to sweat. His gestures became more technical and swift, his expression more focused. He no longer smiled as he had at first, and no longer had the same restraint on his blows. The fights were finally starting to look like something. Chapter 95 Karma is a bitch. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Bang! 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 The clash of the blades was steadily increasing in intensity. The recruits confronting Aeneas were now putting up a real fight. Their attacks were fierce, seeking direct kill. Their physical strength and stamina was also unmatched by that of the first tested. The players were beginning to show their skills, and most of them were relying on their shadow guide to respond without hesitation to the gladiators' expert moves. Not all of them had sufficient agility to imitate their shadow guide in time, but the shadow guide adapted to their reaction time, voluntarily choosing to have them take blows to then counterattack less frequently, but in a targeted manner. One by one the participants were defeated, further eroding the endurance of Aeneas, who was now sweating profusely. The gladiator was already regretting having volunteered. He remembered the last batch of recruits he had been part of 6 months earlier. He had been the only one to show real potential before being brought back to reality by a simple stab by Kazus, who was then in charge of testing them, Hector the former number 2 supervising the event. Of these hundreds of recruits, only the gladiators ranked from 98 to 108 were left, apart from him. The others had either died fighting in the Colosseum or given up after surviving their first fight. Nevertheless, although Aeneas regretted having volunteered, he did not consider himself to be in danger. These candidates forced him to concentrate and show some of the extent of his talent, but he could fight like this for hours. Aside from his guilty pleasure of brutalizing and humiliating new recruits, he had another reason to fight. The test slaves had consumed their Myrmidian blood. It was already taking effect, so each victory made him a little stronger, while stealing the strength from the defeated. He appeared to be benevolent in holding back his blows, but his real intention was purely malicious. He could admit at any time that he was exhausted and let someone else take over, but he knew that by doing so he would incur the wrath of the other gladiators. That tradition was not to be toyed with. In exchange for all these easy victories, you had to be prepared to lose. Another detail that Casus did not mention to the recruits was that the greater the difference in strength between two opponents, the less benefit the winner would derive from his victory. The loser would also only be slightly weakened. This was what allowed the very meritocratic system of the Myrmidian society to flourish. All it took was one lucky victory for a weakling to change his fate. The news of the murder of this or that great Myrmidian warrior was not uncommon. These assassinations were most often orchestrated in the shadows, using a more or less ethical stratagem. The most powerful Myrmidians were actually having a hard time. Most of them had their food and drink tasted by other slaves and rarely traveled without their hand-picked bodyguards. Heck, there was even a rumor that the imperator himself slept with his sword, never leaving it behind, not even in the thermal baths. Orange. The first orange had been announced. The fighter in question was a rather robust participant who had been able to use his oracle correctly. Unlike Jake, he seemed to have practiced a martial art in the past and his reflexes were quite good despite lower ether stats. If he had had the physical strength of Aeneas, the outcome would have been uncertain. After that, other slaves were tested in turn, as the initial long line continued to shrink. Some candidates like Jake had gotten the bright idea to put themselves at the end of the line to glean information. This also gave them another advantage: Aeneas would probably be tired. The poor guy was already giving everything he had. When it was Kyle's turn to fight, Jake watched his performance slack. Jawed. The playboy he knew was shy and barely knew how to use a Colt, but he revealed a completely different side of himself with a sword. As a proper playboy, Kyle was relatively athletic and pretty good at sports. He played virtual reality games without cheating and apparently often played swordsman. The virtual reality with helmets and suits didn't allow you to feel the weight of the blows, but the character in the game would be off balance or injured by the player's bad stances. This meant that all serious players would learn to position themselves correctly and their reflexes after years of VR games were excellent. Jake found that Kyle certainly wielded his sword better than he did. Past the first uncertain swings, Kyle gained confidence in his Thrasgenian body and let himself go completely. Aeneas was finally forced to use 100% of his skills. The fight was extremely violent. Knowing that he could not die in this ordeal and under the influence of Thrasgenian hormones, Kyle felt like he was playing his favorite game again. Aeneas was just another mini-boss to defeat. After a few intense but memorable minutes, Casus ended the fight. Red. Looking cheeky and proud, Kyle raised his chin with a cocky smile while the pretty servant girl painted a blood-red stain on his cotton tunic. When he joined the already tested slaves, Jake couldn't help but toss him as he passed by. "Wow, did you eat some lion last night? You'd better throw away your Colt and get a machete next time." Haha. Just a lot of practice on Elder Scrolls 16 Online. Kyle replied, embarrassed, not daring to brag to Jake. He knew his limits. Jake later realized that he might pay for his years of cheating on virtual reality games today. Karma knew how to choose its moment. And when it did, it was a real bitch. Participants like Jake, addicted to VR, there were a few dozen of them. And none of them cheated as diligently as he did. Once the fear of death was removed and with their newfound Thrasgenian strength, most showed decent martial skills. It seemed that the Earth government hadn't sat on its hands and really tried to prepare the population for what was to come. All these competitions, the fact that some of the games had their own Olympic discipline, the large monetary incentives. This took on a new meaning for Jake today. Orange. Orange. Red, BDNV. There were only players left standing in the line now, and the colors assigned were almost always yellow, orange and sometimes red. Neas dominated the slaves physically, but his sword mastery was not much better than those who got the red mark. By some sort of tacit agreement, the last batch of slaves from the auction in the public square of Helios had lined up at the end of the line, leaving the less experienced recruits to have a go at it first. After what seemed like an endless amount of time, their turn finally came to show what they were worth. Yerode stepped forward with a malicious chuckle, cracking his neck a few times to warm up. "Show me what you've got, big boy. Daddy promises not to hurt you." Hearing the words of the dark-skinned Thrasgenian, Neas' eyes widened in shock. Had he just been insulted? He may have been dripping with sweat, huffing and puffing, but he was far from exhausted. What kind of arrogance did this slave have to believe that he could disrespect a professional gladiator like that? What he needed was a good lesson. "All right, let me show you what I..." Neas threw his head back in reflex, almost getting his head chopped off. Their weapons were made of wood, but at that speed a strike to the neck was just as deadly. A stab to the throat would crush his windpipe, while a side slash would probably break his neck. Yerode wasn't the leader of his mercenary group for nothing. The gladius sword wasn't much different from his military machete, and he had wielded this weapon since childhood. His physical strength and agility was only slightly better than Jake's, but his experience and fighting skills were incomparable. The first sword blow was narrowly dodged by Neas, the second. A downward stroke as violent as a club hit forced the gladiator to kneel down despite his successful block. The third and final swing smashed his head like a baseball bat hitting a ripe fruit. With his skull slightly buckled in and dripping with blood, Neas stayed on his knees for a few seconds before collapsing to the ground unconscious. His condition was critical. No one knew if the gladiator was dead or alive. As for Yerode, he wore a wild smile, standing tall and straight with his sword resting on his shoulder like a bundle. In spite of the cruelty of his action, he was in an excellent mood. He had listened to his oracle and the reward was well worth it. Chapter 96 Black and White. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Well worth it was of course relative. Neas was not yet dead, which meant his ether could not be harvested. The natives of this world couldn't tell if he was alive or dead, but it was simple for the players. The diluted Myrmidian blood he had consumed had negligible effects, and above all, Yerode was far superior physically to Neas. The main reason he was in such a good mood was because he had achieved his goal. His main rivals who would be tested after him would have a much harder test, as an easy victory like his had become impossible. He was obviously not the only one who had the idea to sabotage the test bout of the other participants. The problem was how to pass before him without resorting to violence. The consequences of such a scramble would draw Kazu's attention, and the consequences would have been much worse. Therefore, Jake, the Asian siblings and Elias had all chosen to accept this small loss. The oracle's problem was that it was not giving any real plans. Just a shadow guide to imitate. If it proposed actions that its owner deemed dangerous, she had every right to ignore them. Naturally, the oracle could not be wrong. The perfect path, which was flawless at the time, would then become obsolete. A new path was then generated, taking into account the new intentions of the bracelet's wearer. The real problem was that Jake wasn't confident in his ability to defeat a Yerode wielding a sword. Especially since this time Lamine was there to assist him, unlike their fight in the dungeon where they were chained together. He's still breathing. Well, take him to the infirmary. Kazus ordered 2 gladiators to carry him there on a stretcher, not particularly saddened by his comrade's condition. What is your name, Thrasgenian? The number 2 of the Ludus then turned to the winner of the duel with a certain severity in his eyes. Yerode. The cruel participant held his gaze, unhindered by the gladiator's heavy stare at him. Yerode. There was no need to hurt him like that. Be glad you were facing Neas and not a veteran gladiator. Red. Kazus turned to his fellow gladiators, checking to see if any of them wanted to volunteer to replace the poor battered victim. Much to his disdain, no one volunteered. It's more fun to watch. A gladiator ranked 106th sniggered with embarrassment. And pigs can fly. Just say you're afraid of getting smashed. Another older man scoffed at him scornfully in response. Ignoring the two men's sideshow, Kazus contemplated the opinion of the Ludus veterans. Unfortunately, neither of them seemed enthusiastic about taking on the role. The test supervisor sighed long and hard, resolving to test them himself. Next. It was Louis Feng's turn this time. The young man had a well-trained body, comparable to that of a high-level martial arts practitioner. According to their revelations of the previous day, he was also a professional VR player, although incomparable to his sister. The stance he adopted with his wooden sword was steady and his gaze determined. Seeing Kazu step forward with a sword in his hand did not manage to break his composure. He was used to fighting opponents stronger than him. Attack me. Bang. Louis Feng seemed like a nice guy at first glance, but his actions were extremely decisive when it mattered. This was the most important quality for a serious fighter or gamer. Knowing how to seize every opportunity, well, that was the most important quality for success in life. Lunging forward, the tip of his blade trying to pierce the heart of Kazus ended in failure. The veteran gladiator yawned at the attack, only intercepting it with his own sword. Although Yifeng was thrusting hard with both arms, the supervisor's blade remained motionless, neutralizing the young man's strength. Realizing that he was absolutely overpowered physically, Yifeng instantly changed his tactics. He began to make a series of technical and unpredictable moves, drowning lethal attacks amongst an overwhelming number of feints and diversions. The movements were somewhere between kendo and fencing, with the addition of inventions of his own. Regrettably, Kazus was an impossible wall to cross. After a few seconds of curiosity about the rookie's original techniques, he soon began to retaliate too. Like Neas with the first tested slaves, his attacks gradually gained speed, forcing Yifeng to slowly reveal his potential. The difference was that the young Chinese was considerably stronger. It also allowed Jake to better appreciate his level. His speed was higher than his own, as was his technique. It was predictable. Jake had only been training for a few months. His physique was now relatively athletic, but could not compete with someone who had been practicing martial arts since childhood. Nevertheless, he was confident that he had more ether than Louis Feng. His agility was not much better than Jake's, and his lightning reflexes seemed to be based on learned automatic reflexes rather than conscious decision. This indicated that his perception of time was inferior to that of Jake. The conscious reaction time of a normal person was about 1 second, while that of the best fighters could be as fast as 0.2 seconds. However, it was a mistake to believe that they perceived time 5 times slower. The speed of information processing in their brains was the same. Only their reflexes differed. Louis Feng had excellent reflexes. His blocks, blows, and counters were appropriate, but rigid. Soon, the blows raining down on him became too fast for him to respond adequately, and he felt like a ship in the middle of a storm. A few minutes later, the verdict rang out. Red. Louis Feng was dripping with sweat, his legs were shaking and his breath was short. He was at the end of his rope. This confirmed that his constitution and vitality were also inferior to Jake's, as was Yerode. His sister Lu Yen was of a completely different style. It turned out that despite her higher oracle rank, her intelligence and her unlocked 7th stat, her combat prowess was mediocre. Her stances, techniques, composure and grace were superior to those of her brother, but her physical condition was inferior. Her agility was similar, but her strength was significantly lower, despite a greater overall ether quantity. Without doping, a man's physical strength was generally 40 to 60% higher than a woman's for the upper body, and 25 to 30% higher for the lower body. This meant that strength-wise Lu Yen needed 50% more ether to compete with her brother. In the short term this was not a problem, but it would become a serious issue for women in the very long term when ether's stats would become high. If she couldn't find a solution to compensate for the difference in body status, she would have to redouble her efforts to remain competitive in the future. Nevertheless, Jake was given the opportunity to understand what it meant to be an extreme prodigy. Despite her physical inferiority, her gestures were only rigid at first. After a few dozen exchanges, her technique changed, feeding on Kazu's. After being put in difficulty by a movement, the young woman would rectify her posture, not allowing such an opportunity to recur. Oh, Kazu's was genuinely interested now. It was the first time he had seen a recruit capable of adapting and reproducing his movements despite such a physical gap. After a few minutes, which left the young woman on her knees, leaning on her sword planted in the ground so as not to collapse, the fight ended. Black. It was the first time such a color was announced. Even the other gladiators were speechless. This color had only been called out twice in the past by Priscus. When he had tested Gerolf 10 years earlier, and then Kazus himself 2 years ago. It took one monster to recognize another. If this woman was so exceptional, they were not to disrespect her. She would quickly outshine them in the months and years to come. It would be a foolish mistake to stand in her way. Next. Jake then stepped into the middle of the arena. Like the siblings he was prepared to lose to the invincible boss that was Kazus. Even mimicking his shadow guide with the body control provided by his agility stats, his stance was that of an amateur. Over the previous 4 months, he had practiced all kinds of movements to increase his fitness or lose excess weight, but he had never had any opponent to practice with. His theoretical knowledge was decent, but his practical experience was non-existent. All his fights against digesters he had won thanks to his stats, brute strength and animal instincts. Facing Kazus, the soul of the digester he had consumed affected him slightly, inciting him to bite the carotid artery or tear out the eyes of his opponent. He suppressed these erroneous instincts as best he could, focusing his attention on the gladiator facing him. The outcome of the fight ended in a very different way than the one he had hoped for. White. Chapter 97. A pure novice. You are listening at novelfull.audio. To understand the situation, it was necessary to come back a few moments earlier. In the beginning, the fight had proceeded as planned. Jake had made proper use of his shadow guide, executing perfect parries to the predictable moves of Kazus. Kazus had even thought at the time that this recruit had talent. Then, as with Lu Yifeng and Lu Yen, he had gradually increased the tempo and power of his attacks in order to determine the actual level of the slave he was facing. Even at this stage, Jake had continued to parry the attacks brilliantly, retaliating with unadorned gestures, aiming to kill. He was different from the Asian siblings. His speed was almost comparable, but he was much stronger than Lu Yen. As for his constitution and vitality, he was outclassing them completely. Kazus soon realized that Jake's breath did not accelerate to such intensity and that he was much more resilient, like a tree rooted in the ground. Thinking he had discovered another prodigy, he had abruptly accelerated the intensity of his strokes, taking the fight to a whole new level. That was when the fraud was revealed. Even with a perception of time 3 times slower than that of a normal human, he couldn't respond to lightning attacks requiring instant reflexes. Where Lu Yifeng had retained his technique, responding as best he could to the avalanche of strikes, Jake's technique had completely vanished as if it had never existed. I see. It was just too slow for you, but you don't know how to fight, Kazus had grumbled to himself, before tackling the situation differently. The Myrmidian gladiator was having trouble solving this puzzle. How could someone handle his weapon so well and respond so perfectly to each of his blows, only to become a complete neophyte once the fight had been taken to the next level? It didn't make any sense. Technique and reflexes were supposed to be written in the flesh after thousands of repetitions. To check if the recruit was trying to hide his true level, Kazu's had dealt a real hit to the head, the same one that had knocked Nias out between life and death. Clang! Jake's head had been ejected to the side, the rest of the body following in his wake. The rookie had flown a few yards before crashing into the sand. Kazu's had been left flabbergasted, just like the other gladiators. He was already regretting hitting a new slave so hard. If this one died in his hands, Servius Cassius would give him a dressing down for eons. He had grimaced at the thought of it. But what had happened next had shocked him even more. The victim of his sword blow to the head, which was powerful enough to whack an elephant, had got up as if nothing had happened. Jake had cracked his neck, opened and closed his jaw a couple of times to make sure he hadn't broken anything, and then he had been back on guard once again. The combination of his two statuses had not disappointed him. His constitution had been one of his strong points before, but the Thrasgenian blessing had amplified it. His bones were more than 15 times stronger than those of a normal human. His skin was like leather, his muscles like extremely resilient plastic fiber. The benefit would not be as pronounced when he would regain his normal appearance, but during the time of the ordeal he was a perfect tank. The skin at the impact zone, near his temple, had just reddened a bit. That's what happened when one had a constitution and vitality considerably superior to one's strength and agility. If Jake had to face himself bare-handed, he probably wouldn't be able to kill himself without hitting a soft tissue such as the eyes, genitals, or the crook of the throat. Even the bleeding from a conventional cut would stop in 30.45 seconds. What a freaking monster! These last recruits were each more terrifying than the previous one. Very few gladiators could take such a blow and get up again without a scratch. Yerode and Louis Feng had also been looking at Jake in a new light. Yerode had suspected since their previous fight that Jake was an extremely tough amateur. He just didn't know to what extent. Nevertheless, he was rather reassured. With a sword, it didn't matter how resilient he was, he'd be stabbed the same way. As for the siblings, they had just realized that Jake had more ether than they did, but that he was indeed a beginner. He seemed not to have practiced any martial arts, nor to have actively played modern virtual reality games. Either way, it was better to have him on his side. Most of them had suffered an important intelligence loss when they were altered into Thrasgenian, but Liu Yan and his brother knew full well how important an advantage in constitution and vitality could be in such a long ordeal. Those who were too foolish to realize this would understand it soon enough in the days and weeks to come. White. Again in the present, Kazus saw no point in pursuing the test. He could continue to increase the intensity of the trial, but it didn't matter. This rookie was indeed a total novice and should therefore train with the same rookies who had to learn the basics. The only difference was that he would be supervised differently. Lamine was given the color red. In addition to being an excellent shooter, he was apparently also good with a blade. His strength wasn't up to Yerode, Jake or the siblings, but his agility was terrifying. Not to mention his speed, his strikes were ridiculously precise and controlled, as if the wooden sword was just an extension of his arm. The last one to be tested was Elias, the Lebanese fireman who had seen his wife and daughter being devoured by digesters. Turns out he was a carbon copy of Jake. A thick brute without any technique, who made up for his shortcomings with an athletic body and high ether stats in strength and constitution. His body was noticeably more muscular than that of Jake's due to his extensive training as a firefighter. Because their performance was similar, Jake had therefore more ether. In the end, the siblings, Yerode and Lamine were the 4 players he would have to watch out for. They could definitely harm him equipped with a real weapon and not a crappy wooden sword like the ones in this test. Even if he had to admit that these wooden swords were abnormally solid. When the test was over, each recruit went under a banner bearing the color they had been assigned to. White and yellow were the most numerous, while oranges and reds were more scarce. Liu Yan was alone, waiting patiently beside Kazus. Here's how it's going to be. Kazu started talking again when each new recruit had joined their banner. The top 5 veteran gladiators will be in charge of supervising you. Lutex will be in charge of the whites, Krona will be in charge of the yellows, and Hector will be in charge of the oranges and reds. I will supervise the training of Lu Yen. A small voice answered, hardly more audible than a whisper. Lu Yen, the only one who got a black color. Now that the introductions are made, you can have a well-deserved meal. Training will begin this afternoon, so get your strength back. The new recruits joined the cantina while the gladiators already bearing the mark of the ludus began to train assiduously, recreation being over. Some planted 6-foot-high posts, polus, into the ground, practicing their technique by striking them with a weighted sword and shield. Others began practicing all sorts of body weight or weighted exercises, not much different from those practiced by the CrossFit athletes on Earth. The gladiators seemed used to this routine, moving regularly from one workout to the next. The new recruits watched their training with curiosity as they ate, wondering if they could handle such a training pace. Priscus had returned to oversee the training of these gladiators, and clearly they were not safe from his whip either. With Lutex, Krona, Hector and Kazus staying with them, the slaves were able to enjoy a real meal, comparable to that of the veterans the day before. In addition to the infamous gruel of the day before, they had access to slightly dried red meat, fresh vegetables and fruit as well as bread and cheese. It was not as good as a 5-star hotel, but it was incomparable to the vomit they had been served the day before. Exceptionally, the quantities were not limited either, and Jake did not hesitate to gorge himself. How much and what kind of food they would get afterwards would depend in addition to their future ranking in a week's time on how the gladiator supervising them would evaluate them at the end of the day. Lutex, a rather fat gladiator for a veteran ranked 5th in the ludus and in charge of supervising the whites, told them that Priscus would also drop by from time to time to inspect the seriousness of their training and to check whether the veteran gladiators were taking their task of training the new recruits seriously. BL.net Servius Cassius, the ludus master, also kept an eye on everything that was going on in the arena from his balcony. Taking it easy would thus be impossible and a very bad idea. When they had finished feasting, Lutex guided the white recruits under his supervision into a secondary courtyard away from the arena. At last the training was ready to begin. Chapter 98 The torture has just begun. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Side mission. Follow Lutex's training, 0 of 60, rewards. Better rating, physical enhancement and combat skills, experience points for authority level, risks. Injuries. It was the new mission that popped in front of him when he entered the training area. No probability of failure or success was provided, indicating that he could not fail this mission as long as he did what he was told and as his shadow guide would show him. He then remembered his previous side mission where he had to make a name for himself at the Helios auction. He noticed that the expected reward in experience points to increase his authority level had not been distributed. The mission was indeed considered completed, but the rating and rewards were pending until the end of the ordeal. It was quite annoying because he was hoping to increase his oracle rank during the ordeal to make up for his shortfall. This setback meant that he had to pass his entire ordeal with a rank disadvantage, which could directly affect his performance. Any reason for this delay? Jake, as usual, asked his AI directly. To avoid conflict and insubordination. Your oracle rank is too low and doesn't give you authority over other players, but from the 5th it can be a problem if your rank rises abruptly. And why is that? Because your identity in the ordeal is largely determined by your rank. She answered calmly. For example, in this ordeal, if your oracle rank was that of a general, you could have obtained the identity of a legate or a Myrmidian legion general. A private like you would have been forced to obey, since the corresponding identity would probably have been that of a mere legionnaire of the 9th or 10th cohort under his command. In the first 4 ordeals, the oracle trains you, so it doesn't matter. But later, the objectives given will meet real needs. It can be resources the oracle needs, or a target to eliminate. Even if a player fails individually, the ordeal's main mission must be successful. The main mission is often the same for a number of players. Cooperation is therefore strongly encouraged. I get it. It was very clear. If a colonel was suddenly appointed general, although his ordeal identity would not change, he would no longer be under the authority of the original general. Of course, it was almost impossible to meet a general in a first ordeal. God only knew how many promotions it would take to reach that rank. Turning his attention to his new instructor, he studied the jovial-faced man in front of him. Lutex, as he had learned during his meal earlier, was ranked number 5 among the professional gladiators of the ludus. Despite his puffy appearance, his muscles were well developed and his physical condition excellent. His forearms and hands were abnormally wide. He had to be terribly good at arm wrestling. Just like the new recruits, he was bald, but where the new recruits had shaved their heads, the gladiator was actually bald. He had joined the ludus some 20 years earlier and was therefore the oldest gladiator in the ludus still active after Priscus. He was now in charge of the smooth running of the ludus, not only training the new recruits, but also acquiring them. By and large, he was a resourceful man in his prime of life, and one in whom Servius Cassius had complete confidence. The training yard in which he was stationed also had paulus, wooden sword boxes and other equipment of all kinds. There were many different types of gladiators in ancient Rome. Depending on their fighting style, their equipment and training were adapted accordingly. The Samnites were gladiators wearing heavy armor with the long rectangular shield typical of the Romans. The Retiaries usually wore neither mask nor armor, armed with a trident, dagger, or net. The Thracians, on the other hand, fought with a simple helmet and sword, light fighters with little protection. Finally, the Myrmidons were similar to the Samnites, but their shield was shorter. The Myrmidian Empire seemed to function according to a similar model, and the first thing Lutex asked them was what style of fighter they wanted to be. Jake's choice was obvious. He used a machete out of the ordeal, so learning to fight with a sword would serve as an excellent reference. It didn't matter whether he wore armor or not. A shield was probably a good thing in this world, but where the heck could he find one in the middle of the wilderness on B842? With the exception of him and Elias, most of the white recruits were real scaredy cats. Most chose to become Samnites or Retiaries fighting with a long trident. A few idiots tried to combine the two roles into one, carrying both the trident and a long shield. A few really wanted to become authentic warriors and sought advice from Lutex, who patiently explained to them the advantages and disadvantages of each position. In any case, it was preferable to know how to use all weapons to a certain extent, for an accident could quickly occur in the arena. Once each of them had decided what kind of gladiator they wanted to be, training began. And they were soon disappointed. Since the type of gladiator they wanted to be had no influence on the beginning of it. It was conventional body weight training, exceedingly rigorous. After a quick warm-up of about 15 minutes, Lutex recorded their performance in all sorts of exercises. A 60-meter sprint, their maximum load when deadlifting, bench pressing or squatting. He also noted how many pull-ups, push-ups and other body weight movements they could perform, as well as their flexibility. After all this, they still had to do an endurance test, or they had to run around the yard in a certain amount of time, the pace increasing every minute to the rhythm of a drum. In other words, after all this, the normal slaves, even with the innate robustness of the Thrasgenians, were completely washed out. It was different for Jake. Although he was momentarily exhausted and dripping with sweat after lifting more than 2 tons at the deadlift, his muscles stopped shaking very quickly. Too quickly. His constitution and vitality were so high that it made it difficult to assess his endurance with conventional tests. He could do an infinite number of pull-ups or push-ups without stopping, only Lutex's boredom and pity having put an end to his misery. The endurance run was even worse. He had finished the test by running alone at a speed close to his sprint speed, unable to run out of strength for the minute corresponding to his maximum cadence. At the next gong, he only stopped because he was too slow. Nevertheless, these tests were a great thing for Jake and Elias, as they allowed them to know their exact limits. For example, Jake had a pure vertical jump over 5 meters high. He could also finish his 60-meter sprint in just under 2 seconds. Even without counting the time it took to accelerate, his top speed was therefore above 150 kilometers per hour. Since his actual strength was twice as great as his agility, if he decided to jump instead of making normal strides, he could probably go even faster. Jake realized that he had become a superhuman in the span of a few days. A week earlier, he would have been unable to imagine himself running at that speed. And yet today he was performing these feats without any particular difficulty, as if it were normal. When the tests ended, it was already late in the afternoon and Lutex decided to stop there, informing them that he would give them their personalized training program the next morning. Jake had to admit that Lutex was an ideal trainer. The gladiator was in a good mood, did not humiliate them, and his explanations were clear and concise. He didn't hesitate to show them how to do the right moves, especially for certain weight training exercises that some were discovering for the first time. Nor did the plump man show any particular surprise at Jake and Elias' incredible physical prowess. He merely noted their performance with detachment, which for them was both frustrating and a relief. Frustrating because it meant they couldn't take it easy, but a relief because it ensured they wouldn't waste their time in this ludus. If they were diligent, they would be able to catch up in technique with the other players. Their great initial strength and stamina would allow them to train harder, longer and more often, which would allow them to widen the gap with the lower stats participants. As a matter of fact, Jake was immune to muscle soreness or overtraining to some extent. Since his combined vitality was more than 6 times greater than normal, he could recover from severe muscle soreness in as little as 10 to 12 hours. And this advantage was clearly felt by the next morning, when the recruits in each group were again forcibly awakened by Priscus, with terrible aches and pains torturing them as a direct result of the previous day's physical tests. Their torture had only just begun. Chapter 99 1 week of training. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The days that followed were among the most difficult and monotonous Jake had ever experienced, but also the most rewarding and meaningful. They would get up before dawn and then train from morning to night, with short breaks for hydration and food. The morning was usually devoted to physical strengthening, while the afternoon was devoted to practicing weapons handling and other hand-to-hand techniques. Lutex had not lied to them and a personalized program had indeed been concocted for each of the recruits. And the least that could be said was that he had a real gift for determining a slave's breaking point. Once the diluted Myrmidian blood had been consumed, the training would begin and with it its effects. Those who gave up during their first training immediately saw their fitness level drop, as if they had spent a whole day lying in bed. All their efforts of the day had been reduced to nothing, simply because of a short moment of slackness. Conversely, those who persevered to the end got more than just the benefits of proper training. Despite the poor quality of their meal, their physical condition had improved, and those who gave their all recovered paradoxically better after a good night's sleep than those who denigrated certain exercises. Much more important than the body, Myrmidian's blood was an incentive to strengthen the mind. To make 1 foot's personality evolve in order to never falter in the face of adversity and difficulties. A winner's mentality. It wasn't easy for everyone and soon the disparities between the progress of the different recruits became obvious to all. Especially for those whose levels were similar at the beginning. Jake and Elias developed an unspoken camaraderie very quickly. The 2 poor men were anomalies among the other white-graded recruits. Their physical training was like a punishment you wouldn't wish upon your worst enemy. Pushing, pulling and lifting tons of cast iron all morning long, running 60 kilometers with 200 kilograms on their backs, having to fight and train with a thick scarf around their face preventing them from breathing, everything was designed to make them give in. Lutex quickly noticed that they didn't need a day or night's rest to recover from their physical tiredness, and therefore doubled, then tripled the number of sessions in 24 hours to the detriment of their sleep time. The effects of the blood were limited, as was the quantity and quality of the food, but even so Jake and Elias rapidly gained strength. The benefits of the blood were minimal but were directly reflected in their ether stats. After a week of training, Jake and Elias had gained 1 ether point in strength, agility, vitality and constitution, which was a significant amount of pure ether. As for their body status, their strength had increased by 3 points, as had their vitality, a sign of a high metabolism. Their constitution had comparatively decreased despite their gain in endurance, a sign that their diet was insufficient. The rapid cycles of cell destruction and regeneration associated with training required a high intake of calories and proteins that the luteus did not provide. Their gain in strength was only the consequence of an adaptation of the nervous system. Even with their extreme toughness, their state of health worsened, their tendons and joints became more and more painful, while their muscle mass melted away. They were not recovering so well anymore. A typical case of overtraining that would lead to injury if they continued on this regimen. Despite this, neither Jake nor Elias dared to complain, too worried that the Myrmidian blood in them would activate and consider their complaints as an admission of failure. After a bit of time, Jake believed he understood how the blood worked. Positive emotions and mindsets activated the blood as did negative emotions such as fear, weakness, or a sense of defeat. At the very least, the task in question had to have some significance. One did not weaken for the slightest moment of laziness, otherwise such a life would be unbearable. After discussing this with Shi, he felt that a person who could consciously control his emotions could perhaps become stronger without doing anything. A kind of victorious state of mind even in defeat. Lutex confirmed that this was possible. The very positive and confident Myrmidian children quickly surpassed their peers. Noble families therefore would instill extreme arrogance in their offspring from an early age, constantly reminding them how exceptional they were. But there was one exception. Duels between 2 Myrmidians or blood-consuming people. In this case, there was always a winner. And the blood of the victor, by definition, would always dominate the vanquished, vampirising him of his strength. Believing yourself incredible when you weren't could lead to a painful return to reality. In the afternoons they would learn to handle the weapons of their choice, spending most of their time practicing the sequences that Lutex taught them. After their lesson of the day, they would then practice by striking on wooden poles, palus, or against other recruits. Elias was Jake's training partner and they quickly got into the habit of fighting each other. With common sense, they maintained a very team-oriented attitude, not trying to defeat each other in friendly duels. They needed an opponent of the same level to train effectively, and asking to fight against Lutex was absolutely not an option. A defeat of one of them would have broken this balance. In this way, both of them were able to make up for their martial shortcomings without a hitch. This was not always true for everyone. Many recruits were wounded or defeated in these friendly fights and the clashes between the oranges and reds were particularly harsh. Kyle had been defeated several times, but also had several revenges in return, managing to maintain a status quo in exchange for a few bruises. Not everyone could claim the same. Yerode and Lamine were the 2 scourges of the luteus for the new recruits. The 2 players took a malicious pleasure during the first days to pulverize the few participants who had the bad idea to train with them. This had given them a significant ether boost at first, but since then no one wanted to practice the moves they had learned with them. They had tried to force the duels, but Hector the number 3 of the luteus had put an end to their shenanigans when he forced them to practice with him for a whole afternoon. After that, the 2 mercenaries proved to be much more calm and reserved. Lu Yen was training under the supervision of Kazus and it was apparent, to say the least. The gladiator would share his meals with her, guaranteeing her a luxurious and balanced diet, much to the chagrin of the other recruits. The young woman's progress was also dazzling, her technique changing and evolving at breakneck speed. At times Jake would wonder if he was a complete idiot or if Lutex was a bad teacher. Either way, reality was right in front of his eyes. She was learning faster than they were. From time to time, Jake would also notice Servius Cassius watching their training from his balcony. The middle-aged man gave the impression of being unconcerned, but there was no doubt that he was scrutinizing everything. No event occurring within the ludus was beyond his grasp. Well, almost. His wife, whose name he learned from Kreese, the smuggler, was Licinia, was as fickle as her behavior made him suspect. She too appeared on the balcony from time to time to tease the gladiators. From time to time she would ask for a gladiator to come to her room, and no one would dare to ask the lucky one what had happened when he returned. Most of the time they would come back proud as peacocks, with a satisfied smile on their face. Priscus turned a blind eye to the eccentricities of Cassius' wife, as did the other gladiators and guards. Jake doubted that her husband was ignorant of these repeated adulteries, but quite clearly he didn't mind. A strange couple, very promiscuous. After a week of training, about 50% of the slaves had faltered in their training at one point or another, the wheat from the chaff having been separated. It was also the day on which they would be assigned their provisional rank, and with it the possibility of challenging a higher-ranked gladiator or recruit. For Jake this meant more food. The wooden board at the entrance to the cantina clearly indicated the resources they were entitled to according to their rank. So he knew exactly what minimum rank he had to reach to be able to eat enough and finally regain his strength. He had to rank among the top 10 recruits in order to qualify for a diet similar to the professional gladiators in the ludus, with no limit on starch and legumes. He would have to defeat a true gladiator to qualify for less diluted or higher quality Myrmidian blood. Most importantly, he would get his first wages. This would allow him to use the freshly earned pocket money to solicit the assistance of Kreese, the smuggler. He needed information.